Did you know that the American Revolutionary War was tied to the transatlantic slave trade? I'm sure you won't find that in the history books because we were only taught the lies they want us to believe about history. Let's find out what really happened to cause the American Revolutionary War. We were told that it was a dispute between Great Britain and its 13 North American colonies because of tax on tea and other regulations imposed on the 13 colonies. The colonists felt that the taxes violated their rights. But historians left out how the war was tied to slavery. They glossed over the facts about how rum, yes, rum, helped them win their independence. We're going to look at this article from the Smithsonian Magazine. It says how rum helped the U.S. win its independence. American revolutionaries liked to drink. It didn't matter too much whether they were drinking beer, cider, or wine, so long as it got them busky, biggie, or fuseled. These terms came from Benjamin Franklin's list of more than 200 synonyms for drunk. In essence, the colonists liked to get drunk. But Rebecca Rupp, a writer for National Geographic's The Plate, says in the years leading up to the war, there was one libation that reigned supreme: rum. The rum was used as currency in the slave trade family. Now it goes on to tell us that rum is an offshoot of the Caribbean's sugar trade because rum is fermented molasses. So the drink quickly found its way to the American colonies, so much of it that in 1699 a British observer commented that rum was much adored by the American English as the comforter of their souls, preserver of their bodies, remover of their cares, the promoter of their mirth. Some historians think around this time American men drank on average 3 pints of rum every week. So it's asking the question, was rum the spirit that sprung the spirit of the revolution? But now we need to dig deeper and find out why this fermented molasses was so important. This article from ThoughtCo is entitled, "What was the Triangle Trade?" It says how rum, enslaved people, and molasses were traded for financial gain. So let's look at a few key points. It says the triangle trade involved trading goods for enslaved people between Africa, America, and England. So this triangular trade occurred between 3 ports or regions. The trade operated between Europe, Africa, and the Americas from the 16th to the 19th centuries. It says New England colonies produced rum using molasses from the West Indies, fueling the triangle trade. So in the 1560s, a man named Sir John Hawkins was the one who established this triangle involving enslaved people. It says Hawkins was very cognizant of the profits that could be made from the trade of enslaved people, and he personally made 3 voyages. It is alleged that he was the first individual to make a profit from each leg of the triangular trade. This triangular trade consisted of English goods such as copper, cloth, fur, and beads being traded in Africa for enslaved people who were then trafficked on what has become to be known as the infamous Middle Passage. This brought them across the Atlantic Ocean to then be traded for goods that had been produced in the New World. And these goods were then transported back to England. It says there was also a variation of this system of trade that was very commonplace during the colonial era in the American history. New Englanders traded extensively, exporting many commodities such as fish, whale oil, furs, and rum, and followed the following pattern that occurred as follows. New Englanders manufactured and shipped rum to the west coast of Africa in exchange for enslaved people. The captives were taken on the Middle Passage to the West Indies, where they were sold for molasses and money. The molasses would be sent to New England to make rum and start the entire system of trade all over again. For those who are familiar with the Bible prophecies, you already know how this ties in with Joel 3. Listen to what the Most High said. For behold, in those days and at that time when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations, and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and parted my land. And they have cast lots for my people, and have given a boy for an harlot, and sold a girl for wine that they might drink. Now, if you'll remember, the article from the Smithsonian that we read earlier confirmed that Europeans like to do what? They like to drink. They needed molasses to make the rum so that they could get drunk. They also used it to trade for slaves, who would then be used to make more rum. Now let's look at this word yayin used for wine in that passage, and it means wine or intoxication. So you need strong drink to become intoxicated. This says it's from an unused root word meaning to effervesce, which means bubble and fizzle. And rum does bubble and fizzle up during the fermentation process. As the yeast converts the sugar into alcohol, the gas is released as bubbles, and it contributes to the characteristic of fizziness. So wine that is fermented by implication is talking about something that will cause intoxication. Let's look at this article from the History News Network. Tom Standage says it was the tax on rum, not tea, that provoked the colonists' ire. It says American independence owes much to a dispute over a drink, but it wasn't tea. Even someone with the most tenuous grasp of history will be familiar with the Boston Tea Party, it says. The short version goes like this. In 1773, the British government imposed a tax on the tea shipped to its American colonies. The colonists objected, marched onto a ship in Boston Harbor, and tipped its cargo of tea into the water in protest. Similar tea parties followed in other ports, and relations between London and the colonies soured, leading to the outbreak of the Revolutionary War in 1775 and ultimately to American independence. The full story, however, is more complicated. For although the schism between Britain and its colonies did indeed begin over the taxation of a drink, the drink in question was not tea. It was rum. The dispute began decades earlier in 1733, when the British government passed the Molasses Act. Continuing, it says that New England distillers used molasses to make rum, which was consumed locally and exported to West Africa, where it was used as a currency to purchase slaves. The imposition of a heavy tax on French molasses was intended to encourage the American colonists to buy their molasses from the British sugar islands instead. I'll drop down. It says the Molasses Act struck directly at the prosperity, economic and alcoholic, of the colonists. Let's just pause there. What was making them prosperous? It was the buying of enslaved people and forcing them to work for free. The molasses was used as currency to buy more slaves. Hopefully you're seeing the connection between rum, the slave trade, and the Revolutionary War. The other thing you need to understand is that slavery was about more than skin color. It had everything to do with bloodline. And you'll see that when I share information about those who partnered with the Europeans to traffic our people. We're going to look at this article from the West End Museum. It's talking about rum in the West Indies. It says Boston and Massachusetts served as a center of the slave trade and port of entry for enslaved Africans. By the early 18th century, all of the colonies of New England were involved in an economic alliance with the sugar-producing West Indies, driven by the abduction and enslavement of Africans and the trade of raw materials, molasses and rum. I'll drop down. It says the first spirits derived from Barbados sugarcane were a result of the convergence of Amerindian, African, and European knowledge of fermentation. Plantation owners soon realized that there was profit not only in sugar, but in distilling the byproduct of sugar production, molasses, into rum. By the 1650s, rum production was a crucial part of the work of sugar plantations. By 1660, Africans constituted the majority of the population of the island, and historical records suggest that the majority of rum producers were enslaved men of African descent. By 1700, rum emerged as a major commodity that could be produced not only on tropical plantations, but throughout the Atlantic world. Here you see an ad that was printed in the Boston Gazette and Country Journal. It was printed on June 16, 1766. They were advertising for the sale of enslaved people from Barbados. It says, 4 likely young Negro men and 1 young girl lately imported from Barbados. Likewise, a quantity of good Barbados rum and sugar in hogshead or tierces, port wine by the pipe or quarter cask. Now here in this image you see the interior of a distillery in Antigua. Who's doing the hard labor? The people taken from West Africa. So rum was big business. Again, it was popular because the colonists liked to drink and they were using it to trade for more enslaved people who would be forced to work for free to continue making it. It goes on to say here that the peak of Boston's shipping activity tied to the rum trade and the sale of enslaved people occurred between 1740 and 1769. In the years leading up to the American Revolution, rum constituted 20% of Massachusetts' economy. The same Boston society that demanded independence and freedom from British tyranny continued to grow its wealth by providing Caribbean plantation owners with cod to keep enslaved people producing the sugar and molasses that this economy relied upon. Later, when New England was barred from trading cod with the British West Indies, tens of thousands of people enslaved on plantations died of hunger. Some New Englanders did speak out about the hypocrisy in fighting for freedom while accepting slavery at home and fueling the transatlantic slave trade. White critics of slavery became more vocal about the rights of humanity. Black Bostonians, free and enslaved, became participants in the changing political landscape by organizing and taking part in protests and demonstrations. Between 1773 and 1777, Black Bostonians petitioned the colonial and revolutionary governments for their freedom 7 times. So they're demanding freedom from Britain while they are enslaving others so that they could have wine that they might drink. This article from George Washington's Mount Vernon says during the colonial era, rum was the preferred alcoholic drink of American colonists. So when Britain sought to closely regulate and impose taxes on molasses used in rum production, a spirited protest ensued. And it's going to confirm what really caused the war. It says the regulation of molasses, accompanied by a war on colonial merchants conducted by the Royal Navy, ultimately contributed to the American Revolution. Now let's tie all of this together to see how molasses was used to buy enslaved people on the continent. So this comes from encyclopedia.com. It says the main significance of molasses was to provide a money cargo, almost as current as cash. Once it was exported from the islands, there was little trade in molasses as such. Its real potency came once the New England distillers turned it into rum. Most important, it served as the basis for the triangular trade in rum, slaves, and molasses. New England traders carried rum to Africa in exchange for slaves. These slaves were transported and sold to the West Indies to work in the sugar plantations that produced the molasses. Traders then returned with molasses to New England and sold the goods to rum producers. So who were they doing business with when they got to Africa? Because you know that Europeans had help, right? Refer to Psalm 83 and it will point to the ones they were in league with. This article comes from ThoughtCo and it's entitled African Traders of Enslaved People. So what were the motivations for enslavement? It says one thing many Westerners wonder about is why African enslavers were willing to sell their own people. Just think about it. Why would they sell their own people to the Europeans? It's a fair question. The simple answer to this question is that they did not see the people they were enslaving as their own people. Europeans lumped them all together and just called them all Africans. They were looking at skin color. But there are 54 countries in Africa, and they are not the same people. This says blackness as an identity or marker of difference was at that time a preoccupation of Europeans, not Africans. There was also in this era no collective sense of being African. In other words, African traders of enslaved people felt no obligation to protect enslaved Africans because they did not regard them as their equals. They were not selling their own people. And this is a fact that our people need to understand as well. So how did people become enslaved? Well, many of the enslaved people were prisoners of war. So they were seen as enemies or rivals to those who sold them. It says others were people who had fallen into debt. Enslaved people were different by virtue of their social and economic status, what we might think of today as their class. Enslavers also kidnapped people. But again, there was no reason in their minds that made them see enslaved people as their own. It goes on to say another reason that African enslavers were so willing to sell off fellow Africans was that they felt they had no other option. As the trade of enslaved people intensified in the 1600s and 1700s, it became harder not to participate in the practice in some regions of West Africa. The enormous demand for enslaved Africans led to the formation of a few African states whose economy and politics were centered around raiding for and trading enslaved people. States and political factions that participated in the trade gained access to firearms and luxury goods that could be used to secure political support. States and communities not actively participating in the trade of enslaved people were increasingly at a disadvantage. The Mossi Kingdom is an example of a state that resisted the trade of enslaved people until the 1800s. Do you see how this backfired on them? Not only that, look at what has happened to the continent since then. Do you think they paid a price for their actions? They're still paying for their role in slavery. You have U.S. presidents referring to them as S-hole countries. They had no control over their own resources, and there is constant upheaval and tribal wars. People are forced to leave their homes because of all of the instability. But as I said before, they had help. There are tribes that are still in league with European nations, and they are the ones inciting a lot of the infighting and the overthrow of leaders who really want to help the people. Let's look at one of those groups. We're going to read some excerpts from this book, and it's called The Fullahs of Central Africa and the African Slave Trade by W.B. Hodgkin. It was written in 1843. He's addressing the corresponding secretary at the National Institute in Washington. So he said he's submitting some observations about the ethnography of Northern and Central Africa and upon the means by which that continent itself possesses for the suppression of the Atlantic, or should we say European, slave trade. And just so you know, ethnographers do qualitative research that involves immersing themselves or living in a particular community to observe their behavior and interactions up close. I'm highlighting this section that was written about the Fullahs or the Fulatas. Some of you refer to them as the Fulanis. It says throughout the whole extent of Nigritia or Negro land, the Fullahs undoubtedly occupy preeminence. They are found spread over a vast geographic region of 28 to 30 degrees in longitude, 1,500 miles, and of 7 to 10 in latitude, or 500 miles. He goes on to describe how much territory they control and says the size is equal to a fourth part of Europe and a tenth part of the immense continent of Africa. Compared to the United States, these parallels of longitude would extend from Maine to Missouri. It says the Fullahs are not Negroes. They differ essentially from the Negro race in all the characteristics which are marked by physical anthropology. They may be said to occupy the intermediate space betwixt the Arab and the Negro. All travelers concur in representing them as a distinct race, in moral as in physical traits. To their color, the various terms of bronze, copper, reddish, and sometimes white has been applied. They concur also in the report that the Fullahs of every region represent themselves to be white men, and proudly assert their superiority to the black tribes among whom they live. Please let that sink in. The Fulahs are not Negroes. So for those of you who go to the continent, you need to know this. They may look like you in terms of skin color, but we are not the same people. And as we go on, you're going to see that their behavior will tell you exactly who they are. Listen, it says, in the midst of the Negro races, there stands out a métis population of tawny or copper color, prominent nose, small mouth, and oval face, which ranks itself among the white races and asserts itself to be descended from Arab fathers and Toronto mothers. Their crisp hair and even woolly, though long, justifies their classification among the woolly-haired populations, but neither the traits of their features nor the color of their skin allow them to be confounded with Negroes, however great the fusion of the two types may be. In the Mithridates of Andulong and Vader, the opinion is expressed that the Fulahs belong to a middle race between the Negro proper and the African white race. They consider themselves better than the native Negroes and always rank themselves among the white nations. This part is really going to show you who they are. It says the Fulahs are a warlike race of shepherds, and within this country they have established a political organization, subjugated a large portion of Sudan, and founded Sakatu, the capital of their empire. Now, isn't that how Esau is described? As being warlike? He conquers with the sword. And who did he align himself with? Rome. Indo-European nations. So when you see all of the uprisings that are designed to create instability on the continent and it benefits European nations, giving them access to the resources, look behind the curtain and see who's doing it. You're looking at descendants of Esau, Lot, and some of the children of Ishmael or Hamites. Again, refer to Psalm 83. This goes on to say that they are rigid Mohammedans. They are the missionaries of Islam among the pagan Negro tribes. Where they have conquered, they have forced the adoption of the Quran by the sword. And while pursuing quietly their pastoral occupations, they become schoolmasters and thus propagate the doctrines and precepts of Islam. So we had the Europeans who were forcing our people into Christianity on one hand, and those who looked like us on the continent forcing others into Islam. This is another fulfillment of prophecy. Our people began serving the gods of wood and stone, Christianity and Islam. It goes on to say, thus the Fulahs are now exercising a powerful influence upon the moral and social condition of Central Africa. I do not doubt that they are destined to be the great instruments in the future civilization of Africa and the consequent suppression of the external Atlantic slave trade. I hope you caught that. He said they are destined to be a great instrument, meaning they would be used by Western nations to do their bidding. The writer goes on to talk about how they wanted to gain over the Falatas to the Abolition Party. He says there the axe would be laid to the root of the slave trade. In other words, the slave trade at that time could come to an end if they would get the Fulanis to agree to do it. So it says, whilst at Atsara, a town 2 miles distant from the model farm established by the commissioners, Mr. Shawn remarks, I learned that the law relative to the abolition of slavery had been duly published by the Ata, and that all the inhabitants of the village approved of it as a good law. They confirmed what has been so often stated, that the slave trade would not cease until the Falatas or the Fulanis were gained over to the slave trade abolition party. Now, this information comes from Think Africa. It says the origin of the Fulani, also called the Fula, Fulbe, Pules of West Africa, 4th millennium BC to present. It says the Fulani people, numbering about 38 million, are found mostly in the western part of Africa. They are also known as the Fulbe or Pules in the Middle Ages, covering the 5th to the 15th century of the Common Era. They were very reliant on cattle herding. The Fulani people trace their origin far back 1,000 years to the Senegambia region. They are categorized among the most culturally diverse and widely dispersed peoples in the whole of Africa. Based on 2019 records, in Nigeria alone, there exist about 15.3 million Fulani people. About 4 million in Senegal, 2 million in Mali, 2.3 million in Cameroon, 2 million in Niger, and a great number in other communities across West Africa. Today, the majority of the Fulani people live in more than 18 African countries, with some remaining as nomads. Some futile and unclear theories abound when it comes to the history of the Fulani people. I wonder why. It says a search for the origin of the Fulani people is made complicated by the multiple languages they speak and diversity of countries they reside in, which still poses a puzzle to many anthropologists. A more productive approach to the history of the Fulani people is to focus on the meaning of Fulani identity as placed in concrete historical situations and analyze the factors that shaped their ethnicity. We certainly need to dig deeper when we come across these groups with mysterious genetic history. They don't want their true identity to be revealed. So it goes on to say here that the rise to the political dominance of the Fulani people started as early as the 17th and 18th centuries, with greater dominance in the 19th century. The Fulas took control of various states in West Africa and created empires. With the migration of the Berbers from North Africa to Senegal region of West Africa, the existence of the Fulani came into the limelight, and they spread over most part of West Africa in a period of over 1,000 years. Some Fulani groups have been seen as far as the western borders of Ethiopia. These migrations have caused encounters between the Fulani people and many tribes in Africa, with the Fulani people conquering the less powerful of these tribes. Is it because they received help from Western nations? It says the Fulani civilization is anchored on 4 main groups identified by their family names: Ba, Bari, Jallo, and Su. These identities are linked to the 4 natural elements: earth, water, fire, and wind. They also link it to the earth's 4 cardinal points: north, south, east, and west. The Fulani population retains a physical trait characterized by skin tone, hair, and facial features, which depicts characteristics of phenotype. A typical Fulani may have either dark complexion, a copper-like shape skin with lower melanin complexion, or an intermediate complexion depending on location. Due to the permeation of racist ideology during colonial times and the privileges gained by providing Askari troops to the French and the British, the rulers of the Fulani people consider themselves as non-blacks and refer to their neighbors as Balibi, which means black. Just pause and think on that. It says, despite this stand, their phenotype peculiarities place the Fulani as indigenous to Africa and black Africans to the rest of the world. And this is why they lump us all together and just say they're all Africans. It says their civilization through time can be broken into 4 major periods. Just know that all of the nations that conspired against us and oppressed our people, they won't escape. Their wickedness is recorded on the tablets in heaven. They're going to reap what they have sown. And the ringleader hiding in the background is Esau. Listen to this from Amos 1:11. Thus says the Most High, for 3 transgressions of Edom and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he did pursue his brother with the sword, and did cast off all pity, and his anger did tear perpetually, and he kept his wrath forever. Esau held on to his anger against Jacob and passed it on to his descendants. They showed no mercy. They have been wielding the sword, but there is an end date already written in the heavens, a time when the Most High says no more. That's enough. And everything that has been done to us will be on the heads of our oppressors, not just here in America, but in all of the places where we were scattered. It will be the day of Yah's wrath and vengeance, and he promised to deliver his people. I don't know about you, but I'm certainly looking forward to our deliverance. So we're going to wrap up here, but you're certainly welcome to join me for the upcoming live this coming Wednesday at 8 p.m. Yah willing. If this message has been a blessing to you, please hit the like and share. You're also welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. I encourage you also to check your subscription status, because folks have notified me that they are being unsubscribed. Join me next time.